everybody, to the Land Between the Meadows, a Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host today, Mr. Cable, and we are continuing our county-by-county look here while we are quarantine, isolation, however you want to call it, but I hope that the content that we're putting out is helping you entertain yourself or getting your mind off of the current situation or the current woes that you may be suffering. And as far as things go here, we're going to keep on putting out more Kentucky history content. I hope you're enjoying our YouTube channel. We had a new episode yesterday about William Whitley, which we're actually going to talk a little bit about today as well, so that's a good cross connection there. I hope you enjoyed the author interview we had with Mr. Jim Rumford. I had a great time doing it, and I believe he enjoyed it as well, so if you haven't listened to it yet, check it out. We have some more author interviews coming out, and there'll be one coming out this week with Wesley Brown. He's the author of Hillbilly Hustle. I hope you enjoy that one as well. And while we're in this quarantine, I've kind of decided to start reaching out to more people as well to see if we can get more people from Kentucky or people with connections to Kentucky or have some sort of media out there that they want to talk about that relates to Kentucky. As long as it relates to Kentucky, I guess that's going to be our format, or if the person relates to Kentucky. And that's the way we will go. Seeing where everybody's kind of sitting around not doing as much, then maybe they'll be more willing to do a interview. And again, you can check out these interviews on the YouTube channel or on the podcast app. The YouTube channel does provide a little video of kind of, I guess, our faces. And so you might want to check that out as well. If you do check out the YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe to it and share it as well as the podcast and the links to the podcast as well. And of course, our Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter at KY History Pod. But anyway, let's get down to what we came to talk about today, which is more of Lincoln County's history, and we're looking at Crab Orchard, the Saratoga of the South, so it was called at one time. And we've been having these discussions about the history of Lincoln County, and we've covered the county seat, Stanford, so now it's time to move to the next town. I want to say the next big town, but really when you look at numbers, I don't know if Houstonville and Crab Orchard, how to really measure them up. Houstonville may at the moment, I think, might have a more, and it's probably not that big of a difference, and I probably should look that up, but it's not that big of a difference. But when you look at the history of Lincoln County, Stanford is definitely the most historic. It was there the longest and had a lot of first and a lot of impact on not only Lincoln County but Kentucky in general. But when you look at Crab Orchard versus, let's say, Houstonville or Waynesburg or just the other communities in Lincoln County, Crab Orchard holds a little more weight because of the Crowdwood Springs, which we'll get into here in a little bit. And it really just has more, I don't want to say eventful stuff, because there's other eventful stuff when we talk about Houstonville that's very interesting. But for Crab Orchard, there's just that, I don't know how to describe it. It's just very historic, I guess, to say it that way. It's very interesting. That's another way to put it. There's just a lot to dig into, and there's so much to dig into, I probably won't be able to get it all. I kind of thought this episode may be just one episode about Crab Orchard, but honestly, it may go into two, because there's just a lot of things that happened in the Crab Orchard area that influenced other places, and plus I teach at Crab Orchard. I've learned a lot about the history of Crab Orchard just from teaching there, not necessarily doing this podcast. So I have, I guess, just a bit more to say. But Crab Orchard, for those who aren't familiar, is located 10 miles south of Stanford. It's located on the end of Logan's Trace of the Wilderness Road. And of course, it saw a lot of traffic over the years, over the hundreds of years, people traveling on the Wilderness Road. People came through Crab Orchard. When we're talking about Crab Orchard, let's talk about those people who came on that road. And we've talked about William Whitley in an episode before where we really dove into William Whitley, and you can check it out. I think it's episode 10. And with the video that just came out on the YouTube channel, you can check it out too. So I'm going to be a bit brief about William Whitley because there's not as much that you don't already know if you've already been listening to this podcast. But William was born in 1749 in Augusta County, Virginia. He was a son of Irish immigrants, Solomon and Elizabeth Barnett, and they were actually from Northern Ireland. But he came over with Benjamin Logan and stayed at Fort Logan for some time, and then he built his own little fort, station, house, and so forth. He built it near Dix River, and in 1782 to 1786, it was the first brick house built west of the Appalachian Mountains. And also, William Whiteley was then killed in the Battle of the Thames in 1813. And the side note that it is rumored that he also killed Shawnee Chief Tecumseh. But I say it's rumored because there's other people who say that say other people killed Tecumseh. He also built Sportsman Hill. He built the first horse racing track in Kentucky, and he just hated the British so much that he had the horses race on clay instead of turf, and he also ran the horses counterclockwise. And that's enough really about William Whiteley. You can check him out more on episode 10 and the video on YouTube if you want to, and I'll kind of move on because there's other settlers. And it brings up an interesting family called the Knox family. As many people began to settle around the area, of course there was a lot of Indian raids. And they occurred summer after summer, and the pioneer families, one of the pioneer families that experienced these raids was the Knox family in 1785 near what is called Turkey Creek today. A group of Cherokee attacked the Knox cabin and captured one of George Knox's sons. Where does George go? Well, he goes to old William Whiteley, and they gather up and they round up the local militia, and they pursue the Cherokee to the Rockcastle River and onward, but they're unsuccessful. That's just one example of the Native Americans attacking. And now, the story does not end there. 4 years later, another attack comes. Elizabeth Knox, a teenager, had gone to her brother's cabin, Benjamin. And these are all Knoxes. When she arrived in the evening, she didn't close the door completely. And minutes later, an Indian walked in and had a gun pointed at her. She let out a holler and spooked the Native American, and he shot. The bullet went through Elizabeth's arm and into her brother's chest, killing him instantly. More Indians rushed in, and they began to try and capture Elizabeth, but she crawled under the bedstead and began to fight them off. Old George Knox heard the disturbance, and he runs out, and of course he fires his gun in the air and scares all the Indians away. Now Elizabeth recovered from her wounds, and Ben was buried nearby. She went on to marry James Young, a son of William Whiteley, and later they moved away and actually became quite wealthy, but that's another story. We all know that these Indian raids were because of the settlers coming in and kind of taking over the land and mainly the resources, and of course the natives wanted to fight them off. They wanted it to be a place that they could hunt freely and they could still maintain their resources. But I wanted to bring attention to these stories because they're just very unique, interesting stories, and most likely these stories happened all over the state. Once the first European settler came over the mountains, these stories happened. As we go into the 1800s though, they all begin to die down, and the Native Americans are forced kind of just to leave Kentucky alone for the most part. So a post office was finally opened in 1815, and Archibald Shanks was the postmaster. And I'm bringing up Archibald Shanks because I've seen the name of Shanks often in different historical documents. I think Shanks is also at one time, I don't know if it was a descendant of Archibald or who exactly, but there's a Shanks that actually owned William Whiteley's house for a while as well. And before we get into too much more, Crab Orchard was named Crab Orchard because of the crabapple trees. There was a lot of crabapple trees, and so it became known as Crab Orchard. It might have been wiser if they maybe have called it Apple Orchard, because Crab Orchard is very misleading. There are no crabs in Crab Orchard at all. But Lincoln County was known as the home of some of the best watering places in the South. The mineral springs in the area were host to many taverns and hotels, which brings us to Crab Orchard's crown jewel, the Crowdwood Springs Hotel. The Springs started as a house of entertainment in 1827, and there was the Golden Bell Tavern. And as time went and this began, the reputation grew tremendously, and it was known as one of the finest establishments of its kind in Kentucky. At the peak of its seasons, there would be 400 to 500 guests that stayed at the Crowdwood Springs Hotel. And as I titled Crab Orchard at the beginning, it was given the nickname of the Saratoga of the South. And the mineral springs just brought people from all over. Many hotels were packed, but the Crowdwood Springs by far was the largest one. Throughout its history, part of the hotel burned, and then Isaac Shelby, Isaac Shelby Jr., the son of the first governor of Kentucky, Isaac Shelby, he bought the property and rebuilt it at the cost of about $115,000, which is quite a bit for like 1860s and 1870s. Its capacity was 700 in June of 1827, and it was $50 per month for the season, which is interesting to think that there were people that would come and stay for a whole month. during I would assume the summer seasons. They had a lot of attractions: horseback riding, cockfights, boating, bathing, billiards, and golf. One thing that always supports, or you could even say creates history, is location. Crab Orchard was so popular, or became so popular, because it was what was known as a bonded station. You could get a ticket to anywhere in the U.S. at the Crab Orchard train station. So it was just that well connected. An excerpt that I read from a book talked about the L&N, which came to Crab Orchard in July of 1866. And a man was in California, and he came up to the ticket booth and wanted to get a ticket to Lexington. And as we know now, in Kentucky, you have Louisville and Lexington are by far the most popular or well-known cities in the state. But anyway, this man was in California, and he came up to the ticket booth, and he said, "I want a ticket to Lexington." And the ticketmaster said, "Where's Lexington?" And the man said, "Well, Lexington is in Kentucky." And he said, "Well, the only two places I know about in Kentucky is Louisville and Crab Orchard," which is saying a lot, to think that 100 years later, that those roles have completely flipped. No one's going to know where Crab Orchard is, but most people are going to know where Lexington is, or have a decent idea. But with Crab Orchard being a bonded station, that really helped create a need or a way to get there. It was a destination you could get to. But there was 8 different mineral springs, and all these springs were considered to be healing waters. People would come here that had ailments, and they would drink the waters or bathe in the waters, and I guess in some cases it healed them, or at least made them feel like they were healed, and they were able to then leave or go back to their normal lives. Whether or not it actually worked, I don't believe it did. I don't think there was any. It doesn't work. I don't know what else to say. But it was a very high society place. And we've talked about William Whitley before, about how he was a bit of a high society man, and he wanted to have, or he enjoyed having company in these parties and so forth. And they did these same things at the Crowdwood Springs. They had balls, entertainment masquerades, barbecues. They had these things. There was a spa, and on a side note, the spa was actually used as an outbreak when there was an outbreak of cholera in 1849. But that's another thing. That's another story. But the Crowdwood Springs continued as a resort up until 1930. The main building was then used as a high school until it burned in 1939. And of course, with any destination place, you have to also remember that the Crab Orchard, there was also a Crab Orchard saloon. I did not find a lot of information about that. I guess not a lot of people remembered it who attended, which that's not a surprise either. Some of the local industry in Crab Orchard is, during this time, during the 1800s, there was a lumber mill at one point, but mainly it was hospitality and hotels. And here in a little bit, I will get down to some hotels, because the Crowdwood Springs was not the only hotel. But before we get into more of the hotels, I want to jump back in time a little bit and talk about some of the churches at Crab Orchard, because some of the churches that are still there today have such a rich history, and we've talked about this before. There's so many churches around Kentucky that have been around for hundreds of years. The actual congregations still meet today. One of the things that I always find interesting is when you find a piece of history that is just so old and that has been around for so long. And it really makes me want to go to Europe, of course, because there's many places in Europe that have been around even longer. You know, you're talking about 500-600 years. And just going to those places are always very interesting. But I'm going to talk about some churches before we wrap it up for this episode, because I really wanted Crab Orchard to be one episode, but it's definitely going to be 2 episodes, because again, there's a lot of information, and I like talking about Crab Orchard a little bit. I might have a little bit of bias there, but I want to talk about Crab Orchard Baptist. In 1781, we have talked about Elijah Craig and the traveling church that left Virginia and came to Kentucky. And there were between 500 to 600 people in his caravan. And Crab Orchard Baptist was organized by William Marshall, but was called Cedar Creek Church in 1791. And the first building was brick, and William Bledsoe was the first pastor now. Now, kind of what happened with Elijah Craig and a lot of these and his travelers, as they went and traveled, people would stop. And people would say, well, we're going to stop here and settle here. And so they did, and then they ended up settling or creating a church as well. So in 1792, William baptized the second pastor Jeremiah Vardaman, who was the pastor from 1802 to 1810. Now, in 1808, the church's name was actually changed to Crab Orchard Baptist. It went a few years there, being called the Cedar Creek Church. Now, Vardaman was relieved of his duty when he joined a dancing school in one of the ballrooms in town. He loved the fiddle and he loved to dance. So he was then, I guess you couldn't be a fiddler and you couldn't dance if you were going to be the minister of a church. So that was that. And I think actually William Whitley was the person who may have owned the ballroom. I'm not sure on that exactly, but just a little connection. He wanted to dance so he joined the school. But the major growth of the church came from its third pastor, who was Moses Foley. And under his leadership, the church grew over the next 40 some years to like 400 members. I mean, that's massive. So they needed a new building, and they got one in 1852. But then the Civil War came to town. John Hunt Morgan's cavalry, the 1st Kentucky, raided and burnt Dix River's bridge, burned 120 U.S. wagons while camped at Crab Orchard. And while they were there, some of the soldiers got the measles. This was all around the time of the Battle of Perryville. So on October 8th, 1862, the Confederate soldiers are retreating from the battle, and they're headed to Bryansville, Tennessee. But they broke off into 2 columns, and one of the regiments comes through Crab Orchard. They come through Crab Orchard, and there's a Confederate cemetery there in Crab Orchard as well that's there now. But in 1866, after the Civil War, John James had become the pastor, and the congregation was less than 40. Mainly because during the Civil War, while the church building was being occupied, the church had to relocate, and they had to use a different church, the Emphasis Church, and we'll actually talk about it in another episode. Over the next few decades after the war and after John James had been taken over as the pastor, the church began to recover and the numbers increased. More pastors, of course, stepped in and took the helm. But during the 1900s, the pastors were paid $5 to $12.50, depending on their services. Some of them would preach for more than one Sunday. Some of them would just preach for one. It all depended on how much they did. But finally, in 1915, the government paid the church $1,150 for the damages done during the Civil War. Now, mainly because while there, they just treated it terribly. They ripped down part of the walls, the pews, all of the stuff. It was basically just treated terribly. They did not take care of the building. And of course, I mean, it was at the time kind of a medical place because they were having to use it for the breakout of the disease. And a lot of soldiers are actually buried in the back of the church as well. But in 1948, the church building burned to the ground, and then the current building was built. And it opened in 1950, and they paid $65,000 to build it. And that building is still there today. I hope at one point to be able to upload some YouTube videos on each community that we cover here as well. So so that's something to look forward to as well. But with that, I'm going to stop right here, and we will continue Crab Orchard in our next episode. Again, I kind of knew that this was going to happen, that Crab Orchard was going to take a little bit longer than just one episode, and I don't really want these county episodes to be too long because they can just get a bit more factual. This happened, that happened, this was built. So I'm going to do that. I think about with some other counties, I've just about got all my research done that I can do here about Lincoln County. So Rockcastle County will probably be next, and then I might try to get a few guests to come in to talk about Garrett County and some other counties around. So with that being said, I will wrap it up here. If you have any comments or anything you'd like to add to these episodes, connect to me at KY History Pod. Hopefully some of these restrictions that we have currently will start to be let loose so that me and Mr. Pope can get back together and record some episodes as well. I'll make another plug here for if you want to check out another YouTube channel, check out Family Tree Nuts. You can check out their Facebook page as well. Just search Family Tree Nuts on Facebook and they'll pop right up. Check out our Facebook page as well. Like and share our post. Like the YouTube channel and share it as well. We are getting a lot more listens, and I believe our little community is growing well. So we're going to keep on putting out as much content as we can. If you want to connect to us, message us on Facebook or on Twitter at KY History Pod. Hey, if you have a recommendation of a guest you would like for us to get, shout that out to us as well. I've been looking around and just shooting emails out, trying to connect to whoever is willing to come on and talk to us about their connection to Kentucky. So all in all, I guess that's all that I have to say. We will continue crowd watching next time, and once again, thanks for listening. See you next time.